Do me a favor. Can everybody move down? And I'll explain why in a minute. Can you move down to like maybe the first 3 or 4 rows? At least the first 4 rows? I appreciate it. One reason is I'm getting older and I can't see your faces back there anymore. Thank you. So some people are speakers, I think, and some people are talkers. And I'm more of an extroverted talker. And so I like to interact with people. So I ask lots of questions and want you to get involved because that way you kind of stay awake. And participatory learning kind of helps, I think, because you pick up a little bit more. And there might actually be 1 or 2 things in here that's helpful to you, I hope. So we'll talk a little bit. I'll have lots of questions, and there's no wrong answers, but I'm curious to see your feedback on that during the presentation. So we're going to talk about peer review principles and processes. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Washington County facilities, so I have Franklin Woods, Johnson City Medical Center. I have Niswonger and Woodridge facility as well. So I've been doing that about 2 years. My background's emergency medicine. I worked as an emergency medicine physician for 13 years. I was the medical director at the Med Center for about 8 of those years. I worked with Neil during that time, so I'll call him out. So I don't know if he's positive about that or negative about that. But so we're going to talk about peer review, principles and processes today. First, the disclosures. I did not have any financial interest, arrangement, or affiliation with 1 or more organizations that could be perceived as a real or apparent conflict of interest in the context or subject of this presentation. I'm not selling you anything. I'm not anticipating to discuss any unapproved or investigative uses of a commercial product or device during this activity or presentation. So we shouldn't have any conflict of interest issues. Our objectives for today are to understand the purpose of provider peer review as part of the medical staff process, outline how a peer review case becomes a peer review case, discuss how to report a peer review case, understand the legal aspects related to medical peer review, discuss the nuances of behavioral versus performance issues with peer review, outline the peer review process at Johnson City Medical Center as an example, distinguish between OPPE and FPPE, and you'll learn more about those if you don't know what those mean during this presentation, and understand when to use an external peer review process. Okay, so peer review is something that you're not going to have much exposure to as a resident or a fellow, and I assume most everybody in here is there anybody that's not a resident or a fellow in the room? I know Dr. Pierce, but everybody else is either a resident or a fellow. So you're not going to have much exposure to it, but it's going to become very important to you in the future because you'll be involved in it in one way or another. Either you'll be involved in peer reviewing one of your colleagues' cases, or you'll be being peer reviewed. That's part of the normal process of being a medical staff member wherever you are. So wherever you go, there will be a peer review process. So this is an important thing for you to understand and know a little bit more about. The reason as a resident, we've tried to include a lot of the residents in committees, but generally they're not included in the peer review process in those peer review committees. So you're going to get out in day one when you go into practice. This is something you kind of need to know about and how it works. So how do we know a physician is doing a good job clinically or professionally? This is question number 1 of the day. How do we know?
We don't.
It's difficult unless you have a system to evaluate it, right?
I mean, it's hard to quantify that.
Right.
That's the thing that I always notice with patients. They fill out surveys about how do you physician you, and it's all based on the field. There's no way they can actually quantify your technical level of ability. I mean, unless they have that background themselves. All they know is they like you.
Right. So that's the patient evaluation of what you do. We do have ways of evaluating from a collegial standpoint what you do, and that's what we hope you learn about today. But the point I'm making is, do you think it's a good idea just to rely on self-reporting? Yeah, I led an ED group. I had 60-something providers that worked for me for about 8 years, and then I've been a CMO for 2 years, and I'm still waiting for the first doctor to walk in and look me in the eyes and sit down and say, I'm really not very good at this. I really struggle with colons. I just can't get them anastomosed right. I've not had that happen. You know, I really can't tell the difference between diabetes and congestive heart failure. I haven't had that happen yet. I'm still waiting. But do you think everybody always does everything well? And peer review is not necessarily about taking your privileges away or taking a privilege away. It's about identifying areas where we can improve. And the process moves toward, let's focus on how we can get this person some help or some education in this area to help them improve. Because at the end of the day, it's about quality and about helping our colleagues be better at what they do, and that's what peer review is about primarily. Okay, so the medical staff function, what do we mean by the medical staff function in a hospital? What does it have to do with safety? These are rhetorical questions. You don't have to answer these. Who has the responsibility in a hospital to keep patients safe? And it's really all about quality. Okay, so what do we mean about the medical staff function? Well, so within a hospital setting, you have the hospital, and you have, an administrative part that helps make sure you have the things you need and make sure that we have the resources and the nursing and all that sort of stuff managed. You have a board that's ultimately responsible for that hospital, whether it be a profit or not a for-profit or non-for-profit hospital. They're a little bit different, but that structure is pretty much the same. But traditionally in healthcare, we have the independent medical staff. And the board relies on the independent medical staff to help them determine who is doing a good job, who needs privileges, who doesn't, and those sort of things. That's the medical staff process. And traditionally that's credentialing, that's privileging, that's peer review, which we're going to focus on today, and a few other things that we'll talk about in a minute. And that really, when you think about it, the medical staff function, that medical staff function, is the way that you guys, as professionals, will keep your community safe. Because you have a responsibility as professionals to do that. Not just individually, you have an individual responsibility to your patient, but as a whole medical staff, you also have a responsibility to your community to make sure that your colleagues are doing a good job. And we haven't always done a good job of that, right? Okay? That's why we have things like the National Practitioner Database and those sort of things. That's the government trying to say, well, you guys always hadn't done a great job of policing yourself. So a good medical staff function is your responsibility as a medical staff. Okay. So I will ask you to answer this question. Who has the responsibility to keep patients safe in a hospital? Very good answer. That's changed a lot over the time. A lot of people say, well, physicians are primarily responsible. You are. You're responsible for the safety of your patients. But the nurses are responsible too. The chief executive officer, CEO, the CMO, they all have responsibility in patient safety and making sure the environment's safe. Whether it may not be those medical decisions that are made in the trenches, but there's things like falls and those sort of things that they're also responsible for patient safety. The board has the ultimate responsibility for patient safety in a hospital. Not the physicians, the board has the ultimate responsibility. Now, they rely heavily on the medical staff for that. But the answer is everyone has a piece of patient safety. Very important to understand. And again, it's all really about quality. Okay. So the medical staff function, we talked about credentialing and privileging. People ask me all the time, what does a CMO do? You talk to people out in the community and say, what does CMO do? Well, I said, when you come to the hospital and you need an appendectomy, or you need a cardiac cath, or you need some kind of something, I'm the guy that helps the medical staff make sure that the person that says they can do it actually can. Okay? And the pieces of that are credentialing and privileging. So that's up front saying, did you actually do the training? Do you actually have a clean record? You're not a felon. What does your malpractice history look like? Which, of course, everybody has some of that if you practice long enough. So that's not necessarily something we keep people off the medical staff for, but it's something we look at. So there's all these things we look at on the front end to make sure that you can actually do what you said you can do. And that's an important function of the medical staff, is making sure we give. There's a reason, this is an important thing to understand, that word is used in a hospital. Just because, this is something I didn't like to hear as a resident either, just because you've done the training, just because you've passed your boards, you don't have a right to practice in a hospital. It's a privilege to practice in a hospital, and they grant you that privilege. And that privilege is granted by the board under the direction of the medical staff, and it's part of that medical staff function you have to understand. Okay. We're not going to spend a lot more time on that. If you ever want to know more about how that process works, it's actually long, highly regulated. Surprise, surprise. Everything in medicine is highly regulated. And I'm happy to sit down and talk with you at some point, but that's beyond the scope of today. We're going to focus right here today on peer review. Bylaws, credentials, policy, and rules and regulations are the three most common documents that you will see that govern what happens with the medical staff in the hospital. Bylaws outline your committee structure, outline the governance. In general, credentials policy, that's how we determine who gets privileges and how they get privileges and what your responsibilities are for proving that you can do something. It also outlines usually the process for losing your privileges and appealing that and that sort of stuff. And we very rarely have to go through with that, fortunately. But it outlines all those things. Then the rules and the regulations outline how a medical staff functions. Those are the rules that you function under. Things like your responsibilities when you're on call and responding to, various situations in the hospital and those sort of things. That's all outlined in the rules and regulations. So that's an important part of that medical staff function. And then the medical staff structure itself, which usually is outlined in the bylaws, and the medical executive committee, which is the highest level in a hospital of the medical staff governance, usually has broad powers to structure a medical staff like they need to make sure that it meets the needs of the hospital. And you're always asking this question, do we have the structure right or does it need to change? And it does change from time to time. So this is a general medical staff structure, and why that's important is this piece right here is what we're talking about, is the peer review piece. If you have a small hospital with 20 docs, sometimes all you'll have is an MEC. You won't have all these clinical departments. And the MEC does all those functions. As a hospital generally grows in size, then you'll develop clinical departments, the Department of Medicine, Department of Surgery, the Department of Pediatrics, the Emergency Department, which is sometimes independent, cardiology, which can or cannot be independent. Cardiology is sometimes part of the Department of Medicine. For example, in our case, there's an independent Department of Cardiology. All that's governed by the Medical Executive Committee. They have the ability to put a committee or put a department under another department, create a new department. They have in most facilities and in ours the ability to restructure the governance process as they see necessary for the size of the hospital and what its mission is. And then as you finally evolve to a larger organization like the Med Center, you'll develop these intermediate committees that do the work of the MEC. And most of these function as subcommittees of the Medical Executive Committee. In our system, we have all of these. We have a quality committee of the medical staff, a credentials committee, and multidisciplinary peer review. Information flows up to these committees. For example, a clinical department, the chairperson will review every 2 years when you're up for re-credentialing. They will review your file and see if there's any concerns and recommend you to the credentials committee. For example, the quality committee, they'll look at the departmental reports on quality and your metrics for your department and make recommendations on that. And then you have the multidisciplinary peer review committee. You generally have the clinical departments all have their peer review process, and then that reports up through the multidisciplinary peer review committee. And this is a committee of, as it suggests, many different specialties that can look at cases that came out of the department where there was controversy about their determination on a case, or they may refer it up there just for a second opinion, but they're the ultimate, or the MEC is the ultimate authority on peer review cases, but they're the ones that sort of manage that for the MEC as a subcommittee. So that's the way, JCMC is structured in general. There's more nuances to that, but 50,000 foot view, that's the way it's structured, and many large hospitals are structured. And when you get to 300-400 plus physicians, you start seeing a structure like this because it becomes too much work for one MEC to do. At the Med Center, we have 516 active courtesy and consulting staff. That does not include mid-level providers, which is another couple hundred. So it's a pretty big group of people to keep track of. All right. So question number 2, do you think it's sufficient to rely on self-reporting of negative outcomes in determining medical staff quality? We sort of already answered that question, right? So we have a lot at stake as physicians, and we have this fear that's innate because we've put so much time and energy into what we do. We have this fear that if we admit that there's something that we could do better, that somebody's going to think we're not a good doctor, or I might lose my privileges or something like that. we also have our own perspective on those things that sometimes is not accurate. It's not a very good reflection of the reality about our performance. And so self-reporting is not a very good method. So how does a case get into peer review? How does a peer review case become a peer review case? So the medical staff sets up triggers. And here's some examples. We have more than this, but these are good examples. So if you have an unplanned return to OR, if you have an unexpected transfer to another skill level, a readmission in 72 hours, a procedure with complications, death in the cardiac cath lab, death of a newborn. That doesn't necessarily mean that case is going to get into peer review. It means that somebody's going to look at it and say, well, often a nurse reviewer will have a set of criteria they look at within the medical staff quality department, and they'll say, this was expected, or this was predictable. This doesn't really need to go into peer review. And then there's cases where they say, well, there's a big question here, let's send it to peer review. Then it goes to a group of physicians, and usually at the departmental level, and it'll enter it in as a peer review case then. So that's one way of monitoring, a very good way of monitoring. Of course, it's dependent on how good your triggers are, and those are changing from time to time, depending on the department and the situation. And then you have reports from members of the care team. Those can come from other physicians, they often do. They can come from nursing staff, they can come from others. We have a current system online, most hospitals do, so you can enter those online in a protected environment, usually through the internet. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And one of the best ways is just to call me or to write me a handwritten note and deliver it in a confidential envelope. So if you ever have a concern about something, you can deliver it to the chief medical officer. It's one of the best ways. Elizabeth Speed and Pam Huffine, actually Elizabeth is retiring here in a couple weeks, so there'll be a different name up there soon. But those are our two medical staff quality coordinators who help manage the peer review process for all the hospitals in Washington County. They enter those cases, they go to the meetings, they keep minutes, they help develop letters or communications to physicians from the peer review committees. They have a broad range of responsibilities, but you can report it directly to them too. And they're over in the quality wing of the hospital there at JCMC. You can give it to your department chair, which is another good way. You can report it to the president of the medical staff. Again, I recommend either a phone call or a handwritten note in a confidential envelope. I dissuade you from using email. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. The reason that I dissuade you from using email is, so once that note is entered into the peer review process, there are protections for that. Protections for you as the reporter, protections for the person who's being reported. It becomes a patient safety work product is the legal term. It becomes part of the peer review process. Now, what I've seen physicians do, which is not so good, is write an email to me, which is not best, but it's okay. And still, I can protect that and say, well, that was a report. We're putting it into the peer review process, into a box, and nobody can see that. But what I see so often is I want my other colleagues to see what I've written, because I want them to know that I'm sick of this situation. And so you see people writing and copying people that are not part of the peer review process. And then that whatever you wrote becomes discoverable. Now, anything after that we discuss in the peer review process is not discoverable in a court of law. But if you copy people that are not in the peer review process on an email, which there's such a temptation to do, Neil and I, we're in a specialty together. We've seen this other person from the other group who does the wrong thing for patients all the time. We've talked to them about it. We've told our department nobody's ever done anything about it. I'm going to report this case for the best of the patient, and by God, I'm going to copy Neil on it so he knows how mad I was. Well, that's discoverable. He's not part of the peer review process, and that email now, and you say, well, I don't care. This guy's doing a bad job, and I want everybody to know it, and I don't care if it ends up in court. Well, guess what? You just bought yourself a 6-hour deposition to explain that email, because they're going to pull you in to explain that. I can promise you a plaintiff's lawyer is going to do that. So you've just bought yourself a day, at least in deposition, maybe another day in court, if that ever goes to a legal situation, a lawsuit, either the physician suing the medical staff or a physician being sued for malpractice. So be very careful. It's very important to report. And you have legal protections, which we're going to talk about in a minute, as part of that. But just make sure you report in the right way. Don't make it a public event, particularly if you're saying things like, this guy's only interested in money. He's, you know, you laugh, but I've seen this done. This is money. This guy's a money-grubbing. He doesn't care about patients. You know, I've seen this in emails, and I'm like, oh gosh, what are you doing? You know, just be careful about that stuff because it can get you in a lot of trouble. Make sure you report it in the right way. Be professional about it.
Question about that.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of trouble can you get in the definition of character?
You could,
Stuff?
yeah, you could. Particularly if you send it to people that, you know, it's about a competitor. And I'm not an attorney, so you'd have to ask them. But you can get into all kinds of trouble with them, particularly if you can't prove what you're saying. If it's the way you feel about that care and it's in a medical opinion, but this is a competitor and you're broadcasting it to people that it might have an effect on that competition, maybe people that refer to you, and they get wind of that, well, yeah, I mean, you know, yeah, you could have some issues there. So you got to be careful about that. Just the facts, what your concerns are. An email to the CMO is less preferred than a handwritten or a phone call. And I'm fine with you, I'll get to you in just a second, I'm fine with you saying, hey, Dr. Runnels, you know, Clay, I'm real concerned about this patient. Let me give you the medical record number. And here's what I saw, here's what I'm concerned. I say, okay, we're going to enter that into the peer review process, and we're going to have the peer review committee look at that. Done. All protected, not discoverable, very professional. That's the way you report a peer review case. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They may or may not find it, but here's what you generally do. Here's what generally happens. I'd like to see any emails related to this case. I've had that happen to me before, where I said, I want to see any email communications that you have about this case. Well, if it's an email communication reporting it, you know, I've been told by attorneys that I can say, well, that's part of the reporting process. That's peer review. You know, there's a chance we can protect that. I prefer to have handwritten. That's why I prefer to have handwritten or typed, okay, or a phone call. So I don't have any emails about this case, okay? But they always want email communications. If you've broadcast that email out to 5 or 6 people, I've got to turn that over, so does everybody else who got an email about it that they ask. So that's why it's really important how you report these things. I wanted to strike that home today because I've seen some real mistakes made in that area. So something to think about. We can talk more about that later, too, in the question section. So this is our online reporting system. You go to the MSHA Intranet Pulse page, and there's a button there for patient safety and feedback. And then you hit physician occurrence, and it pulls up this form. Now, the form is electronic. It's not like this, but this is the sort of PDF form of it, and it will ask for these things. And when you enter that, it is confidential. It's protected. It goes immediately into the peer review process. It's a great way to report it. So if anybody on the medical staff ever wants to report a case, this is a great way. It's easy. You can get to it on any internet in the hospital. I mean, any computer in the hospital. Just get on the intranet and follow that. Connect, you know, those buttons. You get on the Pulse page, which is our intranet page. Hit patient safety feedback, and then the physician occurrence button. And there's other buttons in there too, like patient safety. Like if you said, you know, it's not really a physician-related thing, but it is a safety issue. There's a safety button in there too. So I came in, patient's a fall risk. The nurses left the bed rails down. I want to report that. So you can go in and report that in a protected environment too, even if it's not physician-related. There's a separate button instead of physician occurrence. There's a safety button in there too. So go explore that when you get time. If you're up all night one night and you're waiting for some lab results or something to come back, go find this site. It's a pretty good way to report. Okay, so is it legally safe to participate in peer review activities? Absolutely. You're protected. There's all kinds of protections. Okay, here's another question for you. Are there state or federal protections for peer review? Both. Very good. You know a lot about this. That's great. That's great. So yes, there are both. So here's some of the protections that you get through peer review. For peer review, you've got state laws vary, but in general they protect peer-related activities from discovery. In 2011, Tennessee passed the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Act, And it clarifies the protections for healthcare providers in peer review and broadens the definition of quality improvement committees, healthcare entities, and the activities for which they are covered. The most important thing is to know that all of our committees are considered quality improvement committees under peer review, so they're all protected. And why this act was really important is in 2010 there was a case, which I won't go into a lot of detail in, where the Tennessee, I believe it was the Tennessee Supreme Court said, well, the 1967 law, peer review law, protects hospitals, but it doesn't protect individuals that are involved in that. So the state legislature and the governor quickly moved to pass this law to clarify that and say they're protected. If you're participating in a peer review activity, you're protected. And we'll talk a little bit about what that says. The Healthcare Quality Improvement Act of 1986, it established the National Practitioner Database, and it provides protections for those engaging in peer review actions. Okay? And then the final piece I want to talk about was the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Act of 2005. Hospitals may participate in the patient safety organization and obtain confidentiality and privilege for a patient safety work product. There's that word, patient safety work product. This is a cool act. I'm not really a legal guru, but I'll tell you kind of some of the stuff that it does. It really gives people in healthcare a lot of power to look at stuff in a protected environment. So the Tennessee Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Act, what protections does it provide? It says the members of a QIC, as well as those who provide information to a QIC, are immune from liability for damages and other relief for providing information to the QIC. So if you provide information in good faith, you think it's good information, you are completely protected. They cannot sue you. They can't do anything to you individually. You're complete immunity in the state of Tennessee. The records of a QIC are confidential and protected from discovery, subpoena, or admission into evidence during any legal proceeding. Records made in the regular course of business or available from original sources, however, are not confidential merely because they were presented to the QIC. So, in other words, medical records and those sort of things, just because they become part of the peer review process, we can't say, well, we're not turning over their medical record. So that clarifies that. But okay, key provisions in Tennessee PSA, and I'll just draw your attention to two words here. It clearly outlines healthcare providers. So let's see, no healthcare organizations, officers, directors, trustees, healthcare providers, administrator, staff, employer, other committee members, or attendees shall be held liable in any action for damages or other relief arising from provision of information to a QIC or in any judicial or administrative proceeding if such information is provided in good faith and without malice and on the basis of facts reasonably known or reasonably believed to exist. So you have, again, broad protection at the state level for being involved.
Well, that includes self-reporting. I mean, you wouldn't be able to report something that you did yourself, potentially on records, or you would need.
Yeah. From anything that goes on as part of that patient safety work product. It doesn't matter how it's reported. Anything. So if you came to me and you said, look, I think I may have really screwed up in this case, and I'd like another opinion about it. Again, I'm still waiting for that to happen. Had 10 years as a group leader, 2 years as a CMO, hadn't had it happen yet. But someday maybe it'll happen. I really screwed up in this case, and I really, I need somebody to look at it. Well, of course, if it enters into the peer review process and they look at anything they discuss about that case is protected. So yes, self-reporting would be protected. I've never seen that happen. I've never heard of that happen. Mainly because those records are not discoverable. So it's hard for them to find out what you said or whether it would be with malice. Now, where I could see, I'm just mentally envisioning where that may come up. If you said, I'll use an example again. Neil, if you don't start taking your own share of call, I'm going to tell them how awful you are at cardiac caths. Or maybe I even send him an email threatening him. Then all of a sudden there's this peer review case. You can imagine something like that where an attorney might say, okay, well, anything that he said was definitely not in good faith. He was coercing his partner or something like that. If there's something overt like that, I think you could probably get in trouble there. But I've never seen that come up yet. It probably has somewhere. But again, it's just a broad protection. Okay, so the Healthcare Quality Improvement Act, 1986, provides immunity from civil money damages for participants in professional review actions, peer review, except for damages related to civil rights actions, of course. In addition, immunity from damages shall not be available to anyone who knowingly provides false information. So if you lied intentionally to get someone in trouble, again, very difficult to prove. But if you did, that wouldn't be protected. And then, of course, the nationwide reporting system is the National Practitioner Database. That was the piece of that. Okay, so these are important things to remember here. I always try to jot these down in every note that I make when we're doing something with peer review to help remind myself. These are the ways that you get federal immunity from action related to peer review. In the reasonable belief that the action was furtherance of quality of health care, well, of course, we're not doing it for any other reason. After reasonable effort to obtain the facts of the matter. So in other words, you can't rush to judgment. You have to actually interview people, look at the case, have colleagues look at the case. You actually have to do something to look at the facts of the matter. After adequate notice and hearing procedures afforded the physician under such procedures that are fair to the physician. Generally, the bylaws outline that process as long as you follow your bylaws, which are pretty standard. You know, the language that's in there across the country now, you're usually okay with following the hearing procedures. If you follow those that are outlined, you're okay. And then the reasonable belief that the action was warranted by the facts known after the reasonable effort to obtain the facts and adequate notice and hearing procedures have been afforded to the physician. It's almost a restatement, but this provides you immunity at the federal level. And then we have the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Act of 2005. It was passed in 2005, but the regulations weren't implemented until 2009. There's a variety of reasons about that, but it is implemented. Healthcare providers can conduct patient safety activities on a privileged, confidential basis. And then it established PSOs, and no entity is required to seek listing as a PSO. That's a key piece, but so many of them have either joined PSOs or formed PSOs. So again, the PSO is defined by the PSQIA. It's an entity or a component of another organization that has a mission and primary activity of improving patient safety and quality of healthcare delivery, and PSOs have privilege and confidentiality protection, which creates a secure environment for providers to collect, aggregate, and analyze data to improve quality. PSOs must be certified and listed with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is a part of the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. And this is their motto: save lives to reduce harm, cut readmission rates, and privilege confidential data. So PSO, Patient Safety Organization. Mountain States participates in the statewide, the Tennessee PSO. There's a statewide, I think it's supported by the THA. But a PSO, what's really cool about that law, what's really cool about a PSO is it allows you to broadly define what quality activities are, and you can put data and information, not just personal peer review, but quality data, certain levels of quality data into and the discussion surrounding that into a black box that nobody can touch. It's really a protection. Not even the federal government can touch it. There's no federal regulation that once it's part of a PSO and it meets the criteria for what can be part of a PSO, which peer review information does, it's in a black box. I mean, to the point that we've had state and CMS folks come into the hospital for some reason, and they say, well, I really want to see what you did in this case. We're investigating this case that's been reported, and we want to see what you did with the physician. Sorry, it's part of our PSO. Can't see it. It's great when you can tell the government no. It's really great. Can't have it. Show me the regulation that our attorneys say, show me the regulation that allows you to have that data, that information. Oh, you don't have one? Well, sorry, we can't provide that for you today. We've had judges ask for that stuff in court cases. Sorry, can't have it. It's protected under federal law. You have to talk to the feds about that if you want that. So it's good because you can comfortably deal with stuff knowing that you're protected. And all of our peer review stuff goes into our PSO. So it's all protected both at the federal level under the PSQIA and at the state level under peer review. So we have multiple layers of protection for peer review. So you can know when you're involved in a peer review case that it's protected and you're protected and not be afraid. No matter anybody threatening you, you know that you're protected. Okay. What are the differences between behavioral issues and quality performance issues? So does anybody think that behavioral issues are in the purview or in the realm of peer review? Or should it be separate? That's exactly right. So the term that's used often is disruptive behavior. Do you think it's good for a patient when every time that a nurse calls the physician in the middle of the night, the physician yells at them and tells them they're stupid and they're undereducated and they need to quit bothering me in the middle of the night? What is the likelihood that as your patient gets sicker and sicker, and the nurse is sitting there going, well, I know they started out at 140 diastolic, but 98 ain't so bad. I don't want to call Dr. Runnels because I know what happens when I call him. That's a patient safety issue. When you're abusive to the people around you to the point that they're afraid to report issues with your patients, and then you're the one that ends up in court. So there's always a backside to that when you treat people badly, okay? So that's an example of, yes, disruptive behavior can be a patient safety issue. And the Joint Commission, CMS, the states, virtually 100% agreement that now behavioral issues can be patient safety issues. So line is often blurry in cases. Generally, a lot of times when there's a bad case, there's some behavioral components to it, and there's some peer review components to it. So it's very common that we have issues with both when we're dealing with peer review cases. It's often blurry. Disruptive behavior is a quality issue. We discussed about that. Unacceptable behavior is handled through the peer review process. It is handled through the peer review process. A little bit different in our system, which I'll talk about. So how do you define disruptive behavior, and why is disruptive behavior seen as a safety issue? We already discussed this one, so I'll let you off the hook on that. Give me some examples of disruptive behavior. I've given you one. Abusive behavior in person or on the phone. What are some other examples of disruptive behavior? That can be. Substance abuse. Of course, that brings up a whole lot of other issues like physician wellness, and there's policies on that. So being late, not answering pages on a routine basis. Everybody misses one now and then. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about you're being passive-aggressive by not returning pages. Maybe the patient's sick. You don't know it because you won't return the page. Okay? Throwing objects, sexual harassment. Those are some. I've got some lists here. Okay. So the Joint Commission in 2008 defined intimidating and disruptive behaviors, and they defined disruptive behaviors there, include overt actions such as verbal outbursts, physical threats, as well as passive activities such as refusing to perform assigned tasks or quietly exhibiting uncooperative attitudes during routine activities. Intimidating and disruptive behaviors are often manifested in healthcare professionals in positions of power. Such behaviors include reluctance or refusal to answer questions, return phone calls or pages, condescending language or voice intonation, and impatience with questions. Overt and passive behaviors undermine team effectiveness and can compromise the safety of patients. All intimidating and disruptive behaviors are unprofessional and should not be tolerated. And in 2011, they did away with that term, and they said behaviors that undermine culture of safety. So they kind of moved away from that term, disruptive behavior, but you'll still see that in a lot of literature, disruptive behavior. Joint Commission kind of moved away from that term because they thought it was too ill-defined, but it's one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it in your colleagues. You know it when you see it. Here's the MSHA Code of Conduct, and this is policy number 100-104 if you want to look it up on the intranet, but here's some examples: threatening or abusive language, degrading or demeaning comments, profanity, similarly offensive language while in MSHA facility, inappropriate physical contact, public and inappropriate comments about the quality of care being provided by other practitioners, inappropriate medical record entries. Oh, that's a dangerous one right there. That's one that really gets the hair up on the back of my neck. I had a subspecialist one time writing a chart. Patient is not improving because of the inappropriate management by a primary team. Oh, you don't want to eat, do you? Nobody's going to refer to you, first of all. Second of all, you've just opened yourself up for a lot of issues, like we've talked about with emailing the wrong people with complaints about their performance and, you know, stuff like that. You don't want to write that kind of stuff in charts. Be careful about what you write in the charts. Facts. If you want to say something like that, call the doctor. Communicate with your colleague. If you would just do what you're supposed to do, doc, I think this patient will get better. You and I are going to have to disagree about this. But I got to tell you, you're really screwing this up, in my opinion. Have that conversation with directly. Don't write it in the chart. Don't fight in the chart. Don't write negative things about other providers or nurses in the chart. Trust me, it will not end well for you or them. Don't ever do that, okay? That is disruptive. And also it's counterproductive to the care of the patient. Of course, sexual harassment, we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. We know that's bad in any setting. Okay, how do we manage behavior? Behavioral complaints are screened usually by me and my team to see if they're really behavioral events and if there's a peer review component. If there's a peer review component, it usually goes to the peer review committee. I'll send it to them, say this is really peer too. There's a peer piece here you need to look at. If it's purely behavioral and it's what we would call a minor issue, which we define in our process, a lot of times you'll just get a letter from me or you'll get a call. Or maybe I'll have you stop by and we'll just talk about a little bit how you can handle that a little bit differently. A lot of times I'll have the department chair there as part of that discussion. So usually an intervention by the CMO or department chair. They can be referred to the peer review committee, which we talked about, and oversight by the multidisciplinary peer review committee. So if you end up having 5 or 6 or 7 as an attendee, if you have 5 or 6 or 7 complaints in a year, you're probably going to get, your behavior is probably going to be looked at by the multidisciplinary peer review committee, and they're probably going to have we're going to have some discussion about professionalism. We may even request you to do some things like see a professional coach or something along those lines. So we don't get a lot of behavioral complaints. In 2014, I had 95, let's see, what was it? There were 55 physicians who got 95 pure behavioral complaints, no peer review component, just behavioral. That's out of 516 physicians that are active courtesy and consulting, okay? They didn't include the complaints against mid-level providers, which are actually lower in percentage number. We don't get a lot of those. Mostly physicians. There were 55 physicians who accounted for, or 57 physicians that accounted for 95 complaints. 47 of those had 1 or 2 complaints, which can happen. You know, we kind of don't pay a lot of attention to that. But you had 8 providers, when you looked at it, that accounted for 38% of all the behavioral complaints on the medical staff. That's pretty typical when you look at the American College of Physician Executives data and that sort of stuff. It's a very small number of physicians that have a routine problem getting along with people. So we had 8 people who had a problem last year out of 516. Less than 1% of the medical staff got 38% of all of our behavioral complaints. The record was 7. We had 2 with 7. You say, well, 7 complaints doesn't sound like that a lot. But when you only have 1 complaint for every 5 providers, 1 behavioral complaint for every 5 providers, that means if you have 7, that's 35 times more likely than the average, right? You do the math on that? 7's a lot then when you look at it that way. So those people generally get on the radar screen for the multidisciplinary peer review committee. We track these things, and you'll end up getting to have some meetings about that kind of thing when that happens. Okay. Do we need to monitor physician performance on an ongoing basis? So we talked about self-reporting. We talked about colleague reporting, nurse reporting, medical team reporting. We talked about those triggers that we use. Do you think there's value in monitoring performance on an ongoing basis? Well, only if you want to be certified by the Joint Commission. It's kind of a little thing. Only if you want CMS to say that what you do is okay. They really require you to focus on monitoring performance over time. So you've got to have OPPE and FPPE. So ongoing professional practice evaluation, focused professional practice evaluation. There are some standards about how you do that. They don't tell you how to do it exactly. You have some leeway in doing that, but you have to have a process for doing both of these. Yes, it is. It's difficult. Let me tell you about what we do. That'll help you a little bit. Okay, so both are professional practice evaluation, PPE. OPP is ongoing. The regulatory bodies tell you that yearly is not periodic. So you got to do it more than every year. They recommend 6 months, which is what we do. We look at performance every 6 months. And it monitors for changes in practice. Focused professional practice is, there's either no data on a provider or information may suggest we need to look at a practice because something has changed. So with focused, when you come in as a new provider, you have a 6-month focused practice evaluation. That FPPE is more like OPPE because it's broadly looking at your performance. And we'll talk about how we do that. But that is often very similar to OPPE in general. Unless it's like you're requesting a new procedure. So let's say that you've had privileges, but now I've expanded my privileges and I'm going to do whatever, a new kind of catheter or something like that. We're probably just going to look at those cases. It's going to be very focused on that case. It's for a focused amount of time, and in that case, it's going to be something that's very focused in what we're looking at. Okay. Another time that it's very, very focused with FPPE is if we have a doctor that suddenly their ongoing professional practice evaluation, or maybe there's a lot of reports about peer review on a certain issue, this doctor has problems with laparoscopic gallbladders. They have a much higher complication rate than their colleagues. The comorbidities are not much different. We're going to look at that for a period of time in a focused event. We're going to look at all their cases for a period of time to make sure that they're doing a good job with that. That doesn't mean we're going to take that privilege away. It may be that at some point we say, okay, you struggle a little bit with this, so I'm going to have your doctor who has the lowest morbidity and mortality rate on this procedure do a certain number of cases with you. Okay? So we're going to recommend that they do those cases together. And that's what can grow out of an FPPE process. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take we try not to take doctors' privileges away. We do everything we can not to report them, to the National Practitioner Database. We're very collegial, and most hospitals are. But we do have a duty to look at these things, and this is the way we do it. Okay. So focused professional practice evaluation, again, new providers, new privilege, low volume. That's another case where you'll use it. If somebody comes back up for re-credentialing and they do a procedure, but it's very low volume, a lot of times we'll do a focused review on that to make sure we're doing a good job. Period is usually defined, so it's either 6 months, 8 months, a year, whatever. At the end of that period, results are evaluated. So that's FPPE. OPPE, all providers get this, and its review every 6 months is the most common way to do it. It's the way we do it. And it may lead to FPPE. We talked about how if you find something in OPPE, it may become an FPPE thing that you're going to watch for a while, monitor specifically. So the way we do OPP, and many organizations do, is because there's so many physicians, is we use Premier, which is a database. It's called Physician in Focus. And they actually draw out things like your morbidity, your mortality based on DRG data that we have. The data is not real clean. It's 50,000-foot view, and a lot of times we'll see that maybe you have a little bit higher mortality, morbidity, or complications than somebody else, but we find out that because of the nuances of the reporting, that a lot of those cases actually belong to somebody else, and you just got credit for them. Because a lot of times, like with hospitalists, for example, there may be 5 hospitalists that see a patient during a hospital stay, but maybe you got an inordinate number of those cases. So just because OPPE doesn't look good doesn't mean we're going to do anything. It just means we're going to look even closer at that data and see if it's accurate. And the peer review committees do a really good job of that. So think of it as a screening test. So our OPPE, you get this form every 6 months that the department chair has to sign off on. It says, oh, their mortality looks great, their complications look low, everything looks great, sign on. We'll look at that again in 6 months. It's part of what Elizabeth Speed and Pam Huffine do is provide that for the department chairs to look at. I sign off on the department chairs, and I look at their data. That's the way our process works. But, occasionally there will be somebody that comes up in the OPPE process that we feel like we need to look a little closer at. And that's how that process works. Okay, we're getting near the end here, which is good because we're running out of time. What do we do if there's no physician on the medical staff who can or should review a record for peer review purposes? So we have 3 specialists. One of them has a series of bad outcomes. They're all 3 competitive with each other. They're all in solo practice. How do you do that? Well, it's difficult. because you can't let the other two review that case very easily because there's a conflict of interest naturally, because they're all competitors, right? And if you have to take action on it, now you can let somebody, one of them, review that as part of a peer review committee, but generally if you're going to take action and ask them to do something, you're going to have either an external peer review, or you're going to have two specialists, or maybe a specialist from another area that does the same procedure, for example. So it doesn't. You don't have to. If, let's say, a radiology and a neurosurgeon do the same procedure, okay? You can have a radiologist look at that as well. It doesn't have to be the same specialty, but they have to have the same privilege. But again, you still often run into that situation where they may be competitors on that procedure, and you don't have an option but to send that out to external peer review. So there's companies out there that do this professionally. They have contracts with doctors all around the country, and they'll pull somebody in from Seattle or Maine or who knows where, and they'll actually send you the CV of this person to show they're an expert in the area, and they'll review cases for you. And then everybody gets a cut, and that ends up being really expensive. So we try to minimize sending those out. But it can get very expensive, but it can really, really be an important tool when you're going to have to deal with somebody who really doesn't want to do something. I don't have a problem. I don't have an issue with that. Well, the data says differently, and now we've sent 5-year cases out, and 3 of them came back non-standard of care. So yeah, you do have a problem, as best we can tell, and we're going to help you fix it. Okay? I'm not here to kick you off. The medical staff are just going to tell you you're going to have to fix this, and that's what the medical staff ends up doing a lot of times in those cases. But this is a real powerful tool, but it's a very expensive tool. I mean, some of these cases, depending on how long they were in the hospital and how many things they had done to them, it can be $5,000 a case. It can be $8,000 a case. And if you send out 5 cases on somebody, which is really important if you're looking at a practice, that you not just send one case, that you send a series of cases, you can easily spend up $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on an external peer review. So it can get very, very expensive. Fortunately, we don't have to do that a lot, but we do it some. I probably sent out maybe 10 cases last year from our medical staff for external review. Of course, that is not approved by me. It's approved usually by the multidisciplinary peer review committee and the MEC that approve those to be sent out. Okay, so final points. We've got 5 minutes left. The laws are in your favor if you follow the rules, right? If you're reporting in good faith, like we talked about. Confidentiality is critical. We talked about how to report. Have a system to address performance and behavioral issues, right? You got to have that from a regulatory standpoint. We've got to do those things, and as a responsibility as physicians and a medical staff to our community to keep them safe. And then, of course, make sure you report the right way. Okay, so questions, your turn. Ask away. Yeah?
Do you think it's possible that peer review could maybe sometimes adversely affect patient care? I guess what I mean by that is if you're a surgeon and you're really worried about having to take somebody back to the operating room because you think that they could be peer reviewed, or maybe it's a patient, has a really high risk of readmission, and you just don't want to participate in that patient's care because you know that they may get readmitted within 72 hours. I mean, does it sometimes discourage physicians from taking care of sicker patients or patients that at baseline have a higher mortality?
It can, I think, potentially. But I've also seen it reduce that behavior in a positive way. Okay, so let me give you an example. You have a patient that has cancer, and 9 out of 10 doctors wouldn't operate on that doctor. And if you do nothing to them, they're going to live another 6 months. But they have a very high mortality rate if you take them to the operating room. Well, you've done them a big disservice by taking them to the operating room, because they didn't have time to get their affairs in order. You just shortened their life because they had a bad outcome. That's a real life situation. We've seen that happen. So that dissuading people from doing that and bringing their practice more toward the middle of their colleagues can actually be a positive thing. So I've seen that work as a positive as well, for them to say, gosh, my mortality rate's high. So the peer review looks at it and says, well, you're taking people to the operating room, nobody else would. And that's good if you have a high potential for good outcomes, but if you're shortening people's lives, that's not a good thing. And that's a real life situation we've dealt with on our medical staff. So over time, it could be a good thing. I've never seen it necessarily be a negative thing. And generally the if you have a patient who's having a post-op complication, whether it be infection or, maybe they've got an intra-abdominal abscess or they've got some, bleeding, post-op bleeding or something, I've never seen peer review stop them from having the fear of not taking care of that patient. So I think in those settings, it's unlikely to cause them to do anything. And the reality is that most of those type of complications happen to everybody at some level. And so you can't just look at one case and go, well, it's a longitudinal look at their performance. So.
What's this process you've done, and whatever happens, and say the individual had a peer review that don't go to the hospital, and those people look at what peer reviews he had or she had in the past?
No, they can't necessarily look at the peer review, the patient safety work product. They don't get that. But if there were any actions taken against you, you have to report that. Were your privileges ever limited? Were your privileges? So if there's a privilege that's taken away, and there's a fine line there, and it gets down to a lot of legalese that you've got to be careful when we send out these letters. So for example, if I say, Doc, the medical staff's met over this, we've had, the peer review committee really feels like you have a problem with, let's use gallbladders again, for laparoscopic gallbladders. We don't know why you're struggling with that, but it seems like there's a lot of complications with your laparoscopic gallbladders. And we're going to recommend, underline, that for 6 months that we have Dr. Hamilton come in and do your procedures with you and sign off, do a second scrub with you on these cases, or for 3 months, or for 50 cases, or whatever the case may be. I'm not going to stop you from going to the OR if you show up and Dr. Hamilton doesn't come in with you. We didn't tell the nursing staff or the schedulers not to schedule you. That's a recommendation. It's technically not reportable in the National Practitioner Database, and we don't have to report it to another hospital. If it gets to the point that your problems are serious enough that you've had enough, really bad outcomes, not just a few complications, but some really bad outcomes, some people died, some bad things happened. Then we might say, we're going to require you to have Dr. Hamilton come in and do a mandatory secondary consultation and operate with you. Now that's reportable. If that goes beyond 30 days in particular, it's really reportable. So it's reportable to the National Practitioner Database. So we have to report that under law. We have to report that. And you have to report it to the next hospital, and so do we. So, the peer review process is complicated, mostly from the legal aspect. But you have to be really careful about how you set the levels of what you're doing to somebody up. And so the answer is it depends. It depends on what we do and why, as to whether it gets reported to the next hospital or whether it gets reported to the National Practitioner Database. Because technically, if I don't keep you from going into the OR, I've not limited your privilege. I've just made a recommendation that you should do this. We really think you should do this. It's what we think you should do. You don't have to, but we're making a recommendation. Versus, if you show up, you ain't operating unless he's there, or if somebody else with a similar, skill set is with you. Well, that's a limitation of privileges, and limitation of privileges have to be reported. So, yes. Well, again, I can't answer that question because it depends on the situation. They're going to look at all those cases, and it's your colleagues that are looking at that, so the medicine peer review or the surgery peer review or whoever it is. And I can tell you that they're generally very understanding. They're going to look at stuff and say, well, I've been in that situation before, and sometimes there's, it might just be a letter of suggestion saying, well, when you have this situation, you might try this differently because we've had some success doing this. And sometimes there's just feedback that comes from the peer review process in those settings. It doesn't have to be some kind of action. It can just be feedback. Hey, we reviewed these cases, and we noticed that when you admit people, you keep everybody on PPIs, whether they need them or not. They don't have bleeding. We noticed that you keep everybody on PPIs, okay? Well, your C. diff rate is higher than everybody else's. We would suggest maybe you think about discontinuing those PPIs. There's an association there. It's well documented. If they don't need PPIs, stop them when you have people on antibiotics. We notice that your C. diff rate's a little bit higher than everybody else as a complication. So you may get something like that. So, as an example. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, clarify a little bit. Right. So there's a lot of things. There's a lot of tools in that toolbox. There's if it's a procedural thing, you could do the colleague scrubbing with you or making a secondary consultation. There are also organizations out there that do SIM training for some really pretty significant procedures and stuff in retraining. They also do retraining of people like me who've been out of practice for a while and want to brush up on certain procedures and that sort of stuff. So there's those places. From a medicine standpoint, we've required CME sometimes of people. We've had them go to CME conferences and produce that they got the education on that, and then we monitor them under an FPPE setting. We work with a professional coach that can help you with communication skills and help improve your EQ for people that step on toes a lot. There's a whole toolbox of stuff there that we've done for people. So it's not just advice. Sometimes it's just advice. But sometimes we say, you know what, we're going to recommend you do this. Occasionally we say we're going to require you to do this, depending on how significant, how long-standing the problem is. So there's a lot of tools in that toolbox. Other questions? Well, we're at the appointed hour. I'm easy to find. I'm in the C-suite over at JCMC. So if there's ever anything that I can help you with or any concerns that you have when you're on rotation at any of the Washington County facilities, or you just want to stop by and let me buy you a free cup of coffee, which everything's free is important when you're a resident or fellow, I'm happy to do that. So I appreciate your time today, and if y'all have any questions, please let me know.
A new perspective.